Have you ever wondered what would happen if an ancient civilization did not build its cities on the ground, but carved its entire living space into a sheer cliff? If those structures were never meant to welcome outsiders, never designed for easy access, and centuries later, they remain almost beyond the reach of the modern world. This is not a legend, and it is not a folktale. This is Bandiagara Escarpment, a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Mali. A sandstone escarpment rising hundreds of meters high, stretching for more than 100 kilometers across the arid landscape of West Africa. Along its vertical face, structures of stone, wood, and earth cling to the rock-cut chambers, storage spaces, and burial sites suspended between ground and sky. Some of these constructions are attributed to communities that lived here before the Dogon, often referred to as the Telem. They left no written records, no blueprints, no direct explanations, only architecture, and a question that remains unanswered. How do you approach a city that was never built for you to enter? And when modern humans eventually tried to reach this place, what changed? Not only for the site itself, but for the fragile boundary between discovery and interference. Before we talk about exploration or restriction or limits being crossed, there is a more basic question that has to be answered first. What is this place really? The structures embedded in the cliffs of Bandiagara Escarpment are not a single city and not the result of one moment in time. They are the accumulation of centuries of human use. Archaeological evidence show that many of the cliffside constructions predate the arrival of the Dogon people, who later settled along the escarpment and still live there today. These earlier structures, often associated with the Telem, were not monuments in the modern sense. They served practical purposes: elevated storage spaces, living areas protected from flooding and heat, and most significantly, burial chambers placed high in the cliff face. Human remains, textiles, wooden artifacts, and everyday objects have been found inside these cavities, not arranged as symbols, but as traces of daily life and ritual. There are no inscriptions, no written histories, no direct explanations of intent. What survived is architecture shaped by constraint. The cliffs offered safety, but at a cost. Every structure required vertical movement. Every access point was narrow. Every mistake could be fatal. This was not a place designed for growth, expansion, or frequent outside contact. And there is no evidence that these communities were hiding or deliberately isolating themselves from the world. What the evidence does suggest is something simpler and more difficult to interpret. They built within the limits of the landscape, not above it, which leads to an important distinction. The inaccessibility of Bandiagara is not a mystery imposed later. It is a condition that has existed since the moment these structures were created. And that raises a critical question for the modern era. What happens when a place that was never meant to be accessed becomes a target of exploration? For centuries, the cliff structures of Bandiagara Escarpment remained largely untouched, not because they were protected, but because reaching them was simply too difficult. That began to change in the 20th century. As climbing techniques improved and archaeological interest expanded, researchers began attempting what earlier generations could not. They climbed. Using ropes, anchors, and ladders, archaeologists and explorers started accessing cavities embedded high in the cliff face, some more than 100 meters above the ground. The objective was clear: to document what remained, to recover material evidence, to understand who had lived here and how. Inside these elevated chambers, they encountered human remains, wooden artifacts, tools, and most notably, well-preserved textiles. These finds confirmed that the cliffs were not symbolic constructions, but functional spaces used for burial, storage, and daily life. But access came at a cost. Each entry required physical alteration, anchors drilled into rock, paths widened, supports adjusted to allow human movement. At the same time, another form of intervention, was unfolding beyond academic research. As the value of African antiquities rose on the international market, the cliffs of Bandiagara became a target for looting. Burial chambers were opened, not to be studied, but to be emptied. Objects were removed, without documentation, without context, and without any record of where or how they had been found. From a scientific perspective, this was irreversible damage. Once an object is removed from its original position, the information it carried, its relationship to the space, to other objects, to human activity, is lost forever. By the late 20th century, Bandiagara was no longer a place defined solely by its past. It had become a site of intervention. And with intervention came a new question, one that would define everything that followed. How much access can a place like this survive before the act of reaching it begins to destroy what remains? The consequences did not arrive as a single disaster. There was no collapse, no dramatic failure, no moment that forced an immediate stop. Instead, the warnings appeared quietly. With each new access point, the cliff face changed, sometimes in ways too subtle to notice at first. Anchors drilled into sandstone left stress marks in a rock never meant to bear them. Foot traffic altered surfaces that had remained untouched for centuries. Narrow cavities widened just enough for human movement, and in doing so, lost the conditions that had preserved them. Inside the burial chambers, the effects were even more pronounced. Exposure to air, changes in humidity, and repeated human presence began accelerating decay. Textiles that had survived for hundreds of years in sealed environments became fragile once removed or disturbed. Wood dried. Organic materials weakened. The margin for error disappeared. At the same time, control over access began to slip. Paths opened for research were reused for looting. Once a route was known, it could not be unknown. Burial sites that had remained intact for generations were emptied within months. And with each object taken, another layer of information vanished, not just about the object itself, but about the people who placed it there. The risk was no longer theoretical. It was measurable. Researchers began documenting structural instability, loss of context, and growing safety concern for anyone attempting to reach the cliffs. What had once been difficult was becoming dangerous. Not because the landscape had changed, but because human presence had altered the balance that allowed it to endure. By the time these patterns became clear, the question was no longer whether intervention had consequences. It was whether continued access was compatible with preservation at all. The shift did not happen overnight. There was no single decision to close the cliffs, no announcement declaring the site off limits. Instead, access began to change for a simpler reason. Reaching the site had become part of the problem. As evidence of damage accumulated, the logic of continued entry started to break down. Every visit required compromise. Every descent into the cliff introduced new risk to the structures, to the material inside them, and to the people attempting to reach them. Preservation and access were no longer aligned. In theory, exploration promised knowledge. In practice, it accelerated loss. At the same time, external pressures intensified. The visibility of the site increased its vulnerability. Once pathways existed, they could be followed by anyone. Monitoring every cavity, every ledge, every vertical route was simply not possible. Efforts to protect the cliffs began to focus less on discovery and more on containment. Limiting access became a form of intervention in itself, not to hide the site, but to prevent further alteration. In some areas, entry was reduced to essential work only. In others, it stopped altogether. Not permanently, not symbolically, but indefinitely, until a way could be found to approach the cliffs without changing them. What emerged was a difficult reality. A site once defined by its inaccessibility now depended on that same inaccessibility for its survival. And that created a paradox with no easy resolution. To understand the site, humans had to reach it. But to preserve it, they had to stay away. The turning point did not come from curiosity. It came from responsibility. As the scale of risk became harder to ignore, the question was no longer whether Bandiagara mattered. That much was already clear. The question was how it could be protected without accelerating its loss. This was the moment when informal caution gave way to formal action. International organizations, national authorities, and local communities were forced into the same conversation. In 1980, the Bandiagara Escarpment was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, not as a celebration alone, but as a warning. The designation acknowledged both the cultural value of the site and its vulnerability. From that point forward, Bandiagara was no longer just an archaeological landscape. It became a managed one. Access was reassessed, not site-wide, but section by section. Some cliff areas were identified as too fragile for regular entry. Others were limited to supervised research only. In several locations, intervention stopped entirely. At the same time, the focus shifted from excavation to stabilization, from discovery to damage control. Efforts began to document what remained without physically entering every space, using visual surveys, remote observation, and restricted fieldwork. But protection was not only a technical problem, it was also human. The Dogon communities, who had lived alongside the cliffs for generations, were now central to preservation efforts, not as subjects of study, but as stakeholders. Yet even with international recognition, resources were limited. Security concerns, political instability, and the sheer scale of the escarpment made comprehensive protection impossible. Every decision became a compromise. Allow access and risk irreversible damage. Restrict it and accept that parts of the site would remain undocumented. This was no longer a scientific dilemma alone. It was an ethical one, because for the first time, modern humans had to admit something rare, that the most responsible action was not to go further, but to stop. Despite decades of research, surveys, and limited intervention, large parts of Bandiagara Escarpment remain undocumented. Not because they were overlooked, but because reaching them would mean altering them. Entire sections of the cliff have never been entered. Some chambers remain sealed by their own position, too high, too narrow, or too unstable to approach without risk. As a result, some of the most basic questions are still unanswered. How many burial spaces exist beyond those already known? How much material was lost before documentation began? And how much was removed without leaving any trace at all? Even the timeline remains incomplete. Artifacts provide fragments, textiles, tools, human remains, but not a continuous record. There are gaps that cannot be filled by excavation alone. And there is another uncertainty: whether future technology will make safer access possible, or whether any attempt to improve access will simply repeat the same cycle of damage. This is the limit of what science can currently justify. Not because curiosity has ended, but because the cost of answers has become too high. At Bandiagara, knowledge is no longer constrained by what humans are willing to risk. It is constrained by what the site itself can survive. And that leaves us with a final, unresolved tension. How much of the past are we willing to leave untouched so that it can continue to exist at all? In the end, Bandiagara Escarpment did not become inaccessible because it was forgotten. It became inaccessible because it was understood. Not fully, not completely, but enough. Enough to recognize that every step closer came with a cost that could not always be undone. Enough to see that knowledge gained through force, speed, or persistence was often paid for with permanent loss. For a long time, human history has been written by those who pushed further, dug deeper, climbed higher, and refused to stop. Bandiagara tells a different story. Here, restraint became the final decision. Not because the mystery was solved, not because the past was exhausted, but because continuing would have erased the very evidence we were trying to protect. What remains today is not a sealed secret, but a fragile balance. A place where absence of access is not failure, but intention. Where distance is not ignorance, but responsibility. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson Bandiagara leaves behind. That some traces of human history do not survive because we uncover them, but because, at the right moment, we choose to stop.